Hey, what's good? I know it's been a minute, my bad. Just slowly but surely coming back and getting into the swing of things. But we gotta talk about this Larussell situation, man. This thing has been going pretty crazy for a little bit. Over like the last few weeks or so, I've been seeing a lot of news, surrounding him and just a lot of what's been going on. But first and foremost, shout out to Larussell, man. He's definitely someone that I've seen over the last few years, within my timeline, especially on Instagram. I've seen him, just, popping up doing what he's doing, out in the Bay Area. So he's been getting into a lot of controversy, and it just seemed like, once he really risen up from, being that independent artist and then, becoming major, everything just went downhill from there. He signed a deal over with Roc Nation, or to Roc Nation, I should say. If you don't know who Roc Nation is, that's a record label that is ran by Jay-Z. Jay-Z right now is currently not even being looked at in the best light. It's just a very unfortunate situation for him to be in. Make no mistake about it, the things that, the trouble that Larussell's getting himself into, is not by accident by any means. I mean, literally from what I've seen, it's like one incident after the other, but it's definitely not by accident though. I think one of the big reasons as to why a lot of people feel like Larussell's not, this, I guess you could say this hero or hero figure, in a lot of people's eyes anymore, is because you gotta realize that this was someone who not only claimed independent, but moved as an independent artist for quite some time. And I've seen some people online that have said, how can you hate, Larussell and what he's doing right now in his career? He's moving up further in his career. He's, bettering himself and bettering his career. I don't think people hate that he's ascended in his career. I don't think that people hate the fact that he's moved up in his career. I think it's how he's done it, given the theme of what an independent artist is for a lot of people. When you think about how there's been this fight between independent artists and major label artists for a long period of time. You'll hear independent artists that'll be like, don't sign don't sign to a major, don't sign, with the record label, don't sign with anybody, don't even entertain a deal, just go solo dolo, right? Whether you entertain a deal or whether you sign a deal, that's where a lot of people start to really get turned off, because they're thinking how are you just gonna go and sign a deal? Aren't you independent? Are you supposed to be moving on your own? So a lot of people's definitions of what an independent artist is to them is someone who doesn't have the label behind their back, right? Who doesn't have any sort of label support, that doesn't have anybody, helping, pushing and marketing, their music or even just their career in general, right? You're thinking of an independent artist as someone who's gonna go figure it out all on their own, or at least have a team, right? That's where some of the frustration really starts to really emanate from. It's just that kind of thinking. You then have to consider what he said about Lil Wayne, given the comments about Lil Wayne, saying that Lil Wayne doesn't have any substance within his music, right? And I think, although I agree with him, right, although I agree that part of, Wayne's, you could argue some of Wayne's discography, some of, some songs that he's had, whether it's, How to Love, or, just various other songs that he's had, where you could take some of those songs as they have substance within them, right? Some of those songs, some of those themes tend to have some, substance and messaging within them that you could take away from some of those songs, right? But I think part of the mistake that Larussell made within his comments is that he didn't paint the overall picture of Lil Wayne's music discography and what he mainly talks about, right? Another issue that really resonated with a lot of people is really just the lack of communication, right? Just being much more clear with what he meant when he would say something about, whatever the topic may be. And in this case, with, the comments about Wayne, he didn't really make it that much clear. And I think that's part of the mistake that you run into, is when you don't make things clear for people to digest, and you're just like, well, let me just throw up, whatever answer that comes to my mind, and hopefully you guys can guess the right answer, right? Or at least, try to make sense of what I'm saying. I think that's where you'll start to get a whole lot of speculation, and you'll get a whole lot of just people putting words in your mouth that's, not really what you're saying. And then, you know, last but not least, you have probably the most, you know, damning evidence, which is going to be the, you know, Heaven Sent song that recently just, I wouldn't say recently came out, but he had a performance. You know, he performed this live in his backyard, and it's like, you know, it gets to the point where you're like, all right, you know, you dug yourself a hole once, you know, maybe twice, but, you know, as they say, 3 times a charm. This is kind of, unfortunately, 3 times a charm, right? So the first time around, you know, signing the deal, all right, we can kind of tolerate that. I mean, people are going to be upset about it anyways, but, you know, whatever, right? And then Lil Wayne, you know, comments, and it's like, all right, you know, kind of getting into murky waters a little bit, but, you know, I mean, you can kind of survive with that too, right? But then once you get to this, you know, the Heaven Sent song, I mean, that's where it just gets all downhill from here. To mention, you know, in the song, he was basically talking about how everybody is made by God. Everybody, you know, was, you know, created from God, which in a sense, true. He wasn't wrong in what he was trying to convey. But again, this is where when you're trying to communicate a message and you're literally like kind of all over the place with what you're saying, you really can't control the fact that the public is going to be like, yo, like, you literally used the wrong term, you used the wrong word for these individuals that you're talking about, right? In the song, he mentions Malcolm X, he mentions Martin Luther King Jr., he mentions Kanye, so he mentions those names. But then once you get over to Donald Trump, he mentions Jeffrey Epstein, and then he mentions Adolf Hitler, and it's like, whoa, wait a minute, like, hold up, like, what do you... what are we doing here? Especially with Jeffrey Epstein and Hitler, right? So it's like, once you mention those particular individuals, even, you know, to an extent with Donald Trump, you know, President Trump, it's like, some people are going to be like, I don't know about all that. So he ends up getting flack for that. And this is where I think, unfortunately, Larussell's, I guess you can say his future within the industry is basically cooked and it's basically over. I just don't see a comeback. You know, I just don't really see him getting back in the good graces with the public. I don't know, man. It's a really weird situation, you know, like, especially given the fact that you've been given this golden opportunity for, you know, advancement within your own career, especially when you're, you know, trying to make a big splash within the industry, and, you know, you're still trying to, you know, push your music forward, you know, now just within a bigger scene, within the mainstream scene. But yeah, I just think that it's I don't know, man. I just think it's over for him, you know, in that regard. It doesn't make things any better too with the, you know, doubling down, tripling down, and, you know, going back and forth online, you know, with people calling people slow and, you know, misunderstanding or misrepresenting what you were saying. And it's like, at some point in time, you gotta be able to just reel that back in. It gets to the point where you're like, you know what? Like, what am I doing? It's not looking good. But you know, I think that later on down the road, you know, he'll still be all right, you know, back in the Bay Area, you know, like within his community. And I think if he continues to serve that community over there and he doesn't try to keep pushing forward within the mainstream, trying to, you know, appease people just because you're trying to advance within your career, but then you're making all these like sudden career-ending moves to the point where it just doesn't work out for you. So, but that's just my take on the whole situation. You know, let me know what you think about it in the comments down below. I'm out.